Let's face it, in our busy lives, we don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. In fact, according to the CDC, only 1 in 10 Americans are eating the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables each day, missing out on essential vitamins, minerals, fibers, and antioxidants. And that's where Balance in Nature comes in. Balance in Nature sources only the best produce, free from pesticides, heavy metals, and harmful bacteria. And Balance in Nature is the best fruit and vegetable product on the market. They use only fresh, whole fruits and vegetables inside each capsule. They don't use any GMOs, fillers, binding agents, or preservatives of any kind. You're getting real food, real science, real nutrition. I would never endorse a product that I don't use myself, and since using Balance in Nature, I feel more alert, I have more energy, my focus is sharper, and I feel great. Live life to the fullest and choose Balance in Nature. And guess what? PAS Report listeners can get 35% off the first preferred order. Start getting the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables you need by using code PAS at balanceofnature.com.
Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano, and when it comes to 9/11, 9/11 had a profound impact on us and the country as a whole. It changed our way of life, had far-reaching ramifications that go well beyond our borders, and it's a somber day. A day where we need to reflect on what happened, a day where we need to remember all those who were savagely murdered. When you watch the news and specials, many of them are going to talk about 3,000 Americans that lost their lives. And I was talking to my friend, former NYPD Detective Bobby Bell, retired, and he brought up a great point. He said it wasn't 3,000 Americans murdered that day. Since that infamous day, nearly 5,000 first responders, construction workers, and others have died from 9/11 related illnesses. The selflessness of these people digging through the rubble to find their brothers and sisters speaks volumes as to who we are as Americans. If we look at the number of people murdered, it's actually more like 8,000. And we can never forget them, and we can never replace them. These people were taken from our lives too soon. Today, I have two special guests joining me to discuss what it was like that day and where we are today. The first guest is Steve Kuhr. The guy is the GOAT of emergency management. He was also my mentor and someone I consider to be a brother. He has decades of experience in emergency management. He served as Deputy Commissioner of New York City Office of Emergency Management. He was Chief and Division Captain for New York City E.M.S. FDNY, and now serves as the Chief Operating Officer and Emergency Management Practice Leader at Critical Path Solutions. My second guest is Rich Rotanz, someone I also consider a friend. Rich is a retired Chief and Deputy Commissioner of the FDNY. He is the owner and CEO of Rotanz & Associates. He is someone, both of them, they bring an enormous amount of institutional knowledge to the program. They bring real life experiences. You know, when we talk about experts, these are the experts that we should be listening to. In any event, before I bring on Steve and Rich, make sure you hit the follow button so you never miss an episode. Also, go to the PAS Report website, PASreport.com, and sign up for the newsletter. With that out of the way, I want to first bring on Steve Kuhr, friend, mentor, someone that I have profound respect for. Steve, great to have you here. So glad you could join me. Welcome to the PAS Report on this somber day.
Hey, Nick. Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, always. And it's something that's an important day. When we look at 9/11 and everything that's transpired since, you have so much experience in emergency management. When you first saw what was happening, the images that were coming across and the plane crashing into the building, what were your initial thoughts?
You know, it's interesting. I think it's probably important to talk a little bit about my emergency management history to put some context into that question. So I've been doing emergency management as part of my role in New York City Fire Department, E.M.S., going back to the mid-'80s. So like saying my first emergency management job was in 1985, and I've been on call since September 1985. You know, I love these people that complain about being, on call 24/7. In 1996, Mayor Giuliani...
Well, let's back up a little bit because you also were around during the 1993 World Trade Center bombing.
That's actually very true. I'm glad you brought that up. So I was a deputy chief in EMS at that time, deputy chief of EMS operations, and I was I was in training. Actually, paramedics recertify every 3 years, and I was in training with a bunch of other paramedics and senior officers, and we were monitoring the bombing. And as the patient count rose, we were dispatched to the scene. I was dispatched to the scene, and I grabbed 3 other officers, a captain and 2 lieutenants, and responded into the scene. So by the time I got on the scene, fire was still going on underground, and we were in the process of your fire department, Port Authority Police, NYPD, EMS making rescues, treating patients. We had major evacuation operations all the way up to the top of both towers, interagency operations. And I was assigned the role of mutual aid coordinator. I coordinated EMS, paramedic, BLS assets coming in from not only the tri-state area, as if I recall correctly, we had EMS units as far from Pennsylvania. And my initial role, part of the incident command team, was to stage them, catalog them, and deploy them into the unit as necessary. Then as the incident went on, I was assigned a role within the planning section to collect data on victims, their dispersion throughout the city, where they were transported to. And what we found was we had not only people that were transported by EMS, but that, the walking wounded that went to hospitals throughout the city. And that's the final number was based on the work that the team and I did. That was about, I think it was 1,092 was the official injury count, 6 fatalities. So yeah, I did have that experience as well.
And then in 1996, what was going on?
So 1996, after a series of incidents in New York City, a couple in particular, not necessarily terrorism related, although one you might say has a terrorist angle to it, and that was a firebombing in the subway, mid-tunnel between Brooklyn and Manhattan, pretty close to City Hall. And I was on that job too. And I remember the mayor and his entourage walking the incident scene and stopping at 3 different command posts, police, fire, and EMS, each in different areas. And after that, and after a series of other incidents, not terrorist-oriented or violence-oriented, water main breaks, fire structure collapses, the mayor decided he wanted to build some sort of a mechanism to unify emergency operations in New York City. And he created, through the issuance of Mayoral Executive Order 30, the New York City Mayor's Office of Emergency Management. I think it was actually March 19th, 1996. And I was asked to join the leadership team. I was very fortunate to have worked in the past with the director that the mayor appointed. That's Jerry Hauer, who you know as well.
I do.
You and I worked for Jerry in New York State. And Jerry reached out to me and said, it's going to be tough, but I'd like you to join the team. And I went through a fairly aggressive process to get through that job, to get to that position. I was interviewed by the mayor's chief of staff, the first deputy mayor, and 2 other deputy mayors. And that was frightening and fascinating, but exhilarating as well, because it was the beginning of something special in my career. And we did some great things. And I stayed in New York City OEM as deputy commissioner for the next 4.5, almost 5 years.
And now getting to 9/11, because that's important. So we see, OEM get stood up in New York City at about 1996. And then you fast forward to 2001. And did you know when you saw the planes hit the building, the first plane hit the building, did you think that it was an accident, or did you think immediately terror attack?
So here's my story there. So I was at a conference, coincidentally, in Florida for a terrorism response in healthcare community. And a gentleman I was with, and also from New York City OEM, and a dear friend who has since passed from unrelated response issues for another incident, came into the main hall where the conference was, and he said, you need to step outside, something going on. So he tells me a plane hit, one of the towers. And I think like everybody else, he thought it was like a Piper single engine, lost its way or something like that. We started to become aware of the intensity of the incident, the fire that ensued in that particular tower. We had, as part of the conference, one of our colleagues was a naval aviator. He was a captain, U.S. Navy, '06. And we had the hotel bring a TV over to the conference hall, and we were standing around watching it when the second plane hit. And he said, "That's a 737. That's a second tower. This is a terrorist attack." It would turn out to be a 767, but he was close. And that's when we knew that this was a catastrophic event. Part of my story is also that my wife was on the ground for both terrorist attacks because she worked at the World Financial Center directly across the street from Tower One. So I was talking to her. I got her on the phone at one point, and I said to her, I made her an evacuation kit after the first attack, and that was, a pair of comfortable shoes, a filter mask, probably, nothing unlike we're wearing for COVID these days, bottle of water, a flashlight, and a whistle. And I said, grab as many of your friends as you can. And she said, the fire marshal won't let us go. I'm like, F the fire marshal. I want you to go. and she went, and her friends and her got to the street, and they started walking north on West Street. And that's when the second plane hit. And they of course saw that, and they observed both towers falling.
Prior to 9/11 in emergency management, at this point, were there any type of plans or training for plane crashes into high-rise and high-rise fires, and how to tackle that?
So the one thing that needs to be said about the work we did in New York City OEM, and I think you could look at this a couple different ways. Emergency management agencies need to take a risk-based approach to emergency planning, crisis management planning, training and exercises. And we did that. We didn't fully understand why we were doing that, because I went in to be the hurricane guy. I'd studied hurricanes. I knew everything about slosh maps and flood zones that I needed to know. And the director said to me, he said, well, that's really nice, but you're going to be take on the role of coordinating the counterterrorism stuff. And it was quite a growth opportunity. So the mayor, having been a U.S. attorney, had knowledge that he couldn't share. I believe that he couldn't share. He knew who bin Laden was. He knew, coming out of the federal government, he knew much more than we did. But the direction was prepare for catastrophic terrorism. Now, we had not done any specific planning for terrorist attack using airborne missiles per se. And I'll come back to the high-rise question. We had a heavy emphasis on chemical and biological terrorism, and there was good reason for that. If you think about the chemical weapon attack in 1995, that was another incident. This is in Tokyo. That was another incident that brought the mayor to forming the New York City OEM. If you remember, Nick, that was a group called Om Shinrikyo. It was a terrorist group in Japan that had dispersed chemical agent in two cities, both Matsumoto earlier as a test, and then in Tokyo, they killed, if I remember, 7 in Matsumoto, and if my numbers are right, and it's been a while, I think they killed 12 in this Tokyo subway, but injured over 5,000 with chemical nerve agent. And there was also, Aum Shinrikyo had also dabbled with anthrax as a potential biological weapon. So the focus on chemical and biological weapons bore fruit. If you think about it, with the anthrax attacks that occurred post 9/11, which many of us thought might have been actually related, but they weren't. So if you remember, Nick, there were the anthrax attacks on the media and government organizations in New York and DC and stuff like that. As far as response to high-rise fires from either a terrorism or non-terrorism perspective, the greatest fire department in the world resides right there in New York City. And the New York City Fire Department has, just by the very nature of what exists in New York City, the best high-rise fire program of any fire department in the world. I'm convinced of that, as does EMS, because we have responded alongside our fire department counterparts. EMS is part of the fire department now, so that we respond in unison in making rescues and, while they're doing a suppression, and we're making rescues, and we're setting up triage, treatment, transport operations, stuff like that. So, I sort of look at it that way. But the plans we put together for chemical and biological terrorism were applicable that day from a couple of perspectives. One, command and control. So we had worked very closely with the feds, with state government, with area governments to develop infrastructure, command and control infrastructure for a terrorist attack. And as messed up as response can be to major emergencies, everything came together in the subsequent days and months, where there was federal command and control centers such as the Joint Field Operations, the JFO, Joint Field Office, FEMA, the FBI JOC, Joint Operations Center, the City Emergency Operations Center over at Pier 92, all in walking distance of each other, so they were able to communicate. And each of these command cells had connective tissue to ensure unity of effort and unity of command. So kind of stuff did come together. I was part of the team that was planning for the use of the hospital ship. I believe it was the Hope. And, I met the senior leadership of the vessel itself. And when that rolled into New York City that morning, I was so proud because I was part of that. Also, the Strategic National Stockpile. I was part of the team that put together with CDC and there was no Homeland Security, Department of Justice, FEMA plans to accept, receive, and deploys national stockpile. So the national stockpile is a federal program where medical equipment is stored in classified locations throughout the country. And I still don't know where they are in the New York area, but they were on the ground, I believe, within 6 or 8 hours. And the stockpile is also used for the pandemic because they store medications like antivirals and antibiotics. So the message I'm trying to paint for you, Nick, is that we did all sort of preparedness for terrorism operations that came to bear that day.
And, when we look at that day, so we're going to hear the media reports, we're going to see the specials, and there's constant talk of the nearly 3,000 people that lost their lives that day. But it's actually far deeper than that. So that day you had, nearly 3,000 Americans murdered. But in the subsequent years, we've seen a lot of first responders come down with illnesses, particularly certain types of cancers all over their body and everything. And there's an additional nearly 5,000 people that we could say were murdered on 9/11. They may have died after 9/11, but they were murdered on 9/11. And one of those people was your brother-in-law, Mark Harris. Can you explain, how many people you've worked with that you've had to see get sick and pass away from these 9/11 illnesses?
I stopped attending 9/11 funerals after, I think it was 3. Not out of disrespect for those that had passed, because I knew so many that were killed that day in the fire department and EMS, et cetera, Port Authority. I knew some of the people there. And that was because that was just a little self-preservation because I worked the attacks. I was there. By the time I said I was at a conference, getting back to New York itself was a bit of a story. But I worked the next 10 months or a year. So I knew a lot of these people, and I worked with a lot of these people beforehand. For example, I led a team to the Dominican Republic in 1998 for a catastrophic hurricane, and one of the firefighters was my operations chief at that. And it saddens me that he passed that day on 9/11 because he had left OEM and gone back to his role in FDNY hazmat. So I don't think we could have foreseen that 22 years later, we still have an active recovery effort from a terrorist attack that happened in 2001. So I myself am in the 9/11 health program. I'm sure every responder, New York City or otherwise that came to help us that day are in the program. If not, I would like them to seek it out so they can get monitored for certain cancers and other illnesses. And I'm what they call certified for certain illnesses. Thankfully, they're not as catastrophic as others, which is a segue into my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law, my sister's husband, they were married in 2011. They were childhood sweethearts, and they found each other on Facebook years later after going through their own marriages, having kids and divorcing. And they were married in 2011 at my father's bedside at the VA hospital in West Palm Beach. He had passed actually a few days later, a few weeks later, but he was sick, so we took the wedding to the hospital. And Mark was a rescue paramedic, which is different than just a regular paramedic. He was specially trained to work on special operations rescue companies. They were trained to use different medications, to train to support, respond, and work within rescue operations such as collapse zones, entrapments, etc. And Mark had responded on 9/11 from his station. And as I understand the story, when the towers collapsed, like many others, he was entrapped in the rubble and was subject to harsh environmental conditions, including the dust. Your viewers would recall, I believe, your listeners, I should say, would recall the dust many people were covered in when he was that. Mark began suffering a series or a number of head, neck, and throat cancers as time went on. And it became very catastrophic. He was subject to many surgeries where much of his anatomical structures in the upper airway and throat were removed, and he'd gone through radiation and chemo. And on May 13th, 2017, he passed. And he was given a tremendous send-off by the Palm Beach County Fire Rescue, who led a fire service-based funeral, and it was actually done beautifully at the. There was a 9/11 memorial in Florida, in west side of Palm Beach County, and it was done right there at the memorial, with a steel from the building and a beautiful park. So my point of telling that story is that there are responders, construction workers, people in non-emergency service roles. I don't want to leave anybody out that were subject to those harsh conditions and are still dying today. As far as I know, there's funding or some funding that goes out 99 years, but it's critical that our elected officials understand the trauma that those responding to the scene went through, and it might continue to go through for many years to come. It's hard to think that that's 22 years ago. You know, when I was born in 1961, Pearl Harbor was 20 years before that. So I just gave you my age, right? And now it's hard to think that there's so many people that 20 years ago are still suffering.
It is. And I see, I look at it in my students' faces. So 9/11 is something that I remember extraordinarily vividly, every detail of the day, where I was, who I was with, and everything. And most people alive that day do. Then I look at my students, today's students, and I look at them, and I'm talking about 9/11, and they don't have the interest that they once had. And it finally dawned on me that they view 9/11 as I view Pearl Harbor, a moment in time in our history that happened that was horrendous, but there wasn't the personal connection. My students, most of them, have been born after 9/11. And so now here we are, 21 years later. That's a long time. And we've seen this ramp up in emergency management and homeland security. One of the fears I have, though, is that over the last couple of years, the last 2 or 3 years, I feel that the emergency management leaders have almost taken a backseat to other agencies, other departments, to the political figures. What's your view on the current state of emergency management?
It's interesting you say that, because I struggle with what's going on in the emergency management community and what I'm seeing in the business, especially with young and mid-career emergency managers. There's a tremendous focus on resilience, and I'm not quite sure we as an industry, or even the individuals that really promote this, understand what resilience means. I'm not poo-pooing resilience, because I understand the value of it and the need for it, but you see very little discussion about a risk-based approach to emergency management or the crisis management need of an emergency management agency. I've even heard it say that emergency management agencies should not be involved in a response. Well, that, I believe, comes from a generation of emergency managers that have not been in the rubble, that have not had, and I'm generalizing, and I don't mean to disrespect any of my colleagues above me or younger than me in age, but we have a group of emergency managers that may not have that crisis management experience, maybe don't understand the need or how to go from 0 to 60 at a moment's notice for a an unanticipated sudden onset event, like a terrorist attack or a gas explosion or an active shooter event. And I'm not talking about law enforcement response. I'm not talking about EMS or fire department response or something like that. I'm talking about going hot, getting an EOC stood up, having that EOC ready. That's part of resilience in my mind. Having that command center ready, having those relationships in place, having exercised plans in place, and having exercised the plan. So when we ring the bell as emergency managers, the other agencies come and support that operation. So my message is I want emergency managers to focus on resilience. I want emergency managers to balance that with a focus on crisis management, and then post the response phase, certainly the recovery phase. Now, there's typically an emphasis on recovery, and that's probably part of resilience. But we have, because in a natural hazard event, for example, like a hurricane, a flood, or a wildfire, there might be federal remuneration available. So emergency management agencies are naturally well suited to work in that space. But I just I send a message to emergency managers in all critical infrastructure sectors and all communities. Take a risk-based approach to emergency management. That's what we did in New York. And maybe you might not think you have a terrorist threat. And I'm not, after 9/11, when Homeland Security was formed, everything was terrorism. And there were a lot of failures in Katrina because of that. That's a whole separate podcast we could have, right? So we won't talk about that. But I want emergency managers to consider terrorism as something that could be local. So I was an emergency manager in a large city in Colorado, and the second largest city in Colorado, and we had 5 military bases in town, and domestic and international terrorism was on our agenda, and we focused on that. And I would encourage emergency managers, regardless of the size of your community or what infrastructure you're protecting, business continuity, director of resilience, security directors, whatever, consider that terrorism could still occur. And that's going to be both global and or domestic terrorism.
And I think that's a really important point. I mean, when we look at the evolution of emergency management, the people prior to 2001 that were in emergency management had the life experiences. They responded to the disasters for years. Then you look at people like myself that end up getting a degree in emergency management and going in. Now, luckily, I had you to mentor me. But the reality is that a textbook can't teach you how to plan for, prepare for, and respond to a disaster. It helps build the foundation of emergency management, helps you learn the ins and outs of terminology and what the structures of an incident command system are. However, the life experiences is where you really learn. And I think that's a good point.
There's controversy over whether emergency managers should have prior public safety experience, and that certainly helped me and my colleagues, what you're saying, going back into the 1990s, because I had been an incident commander. I'd been a crisis manager for years leading up to my appointment at New York City OEM. So to go hot, stand up in ESC and command an operation or coordinate an operation of that magnitude was sort of something I had already been doing. And I agree with you about the degree thing, and that is probably a balance that we need to strike. And it would be valuable for universities that have degree programs in emergency management, homeland security, to ensure that students have some sort of internships as part of the degree process in a active emergency management environment, or fire department or EMS agency or police department, so they can envision a command situation coming out of, if you're 22 years old, you come out with a degree in emergency management and you're looking for a job, you might find an entry-level job in one of the critical infrastructure sectors or in a community or state, but that doesn't mean you're ready to go hot. And you gotta seek out the old guy or the old individual in the team and get the war stories and understand that part of it.
100%. I completely agree. I think it's really important, especially to remember that on a day like this. Steve, I want to thank you for joining me, and I really appreciate you coming on.
It's my pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to tell my story, and it's always a pleasure to see you, bro.
We've all been there before. You want to get someone the perfect gift for the perfect occasion, but you have no idea what to get. Well, you don't have to rack your brain anymore. Gift baskets are perfect for any occasion, whether it's birthdays, holidays, corporate events, or a simple thank you. At designeryourselfgiftbaskets.com, you get to choose the theme and the products that go into the basket. You have a coffee lover? Try the K-Cup basket. You're looking for something special for the person that loves to barbecue? No problem. There's a basket for it. Make every basket unique to the person you're sending it to. And if you're in a rush and don't have time to customize the gift basket, it's not an issue because at DIYGB.com, you can choose from hundreds of pre-arranged baskets based on the occasion, theme, or recipient. And PAS Report listeners get 10% off using code PAS at checkout. So go to DIYGB.com, find the perfect gift for the perfect occasion, and use coupon code PAS at checkout to get 10% off your order. Visit DIYGB.com today. And now I want to welcome Rich Rotanz to the PAS Report. Rich is a retired captain and deputy commissioner, FDNY. Rich, pleasure to have you here.
The pleasure to always be with you there, Professor.
So when we look at 9/11, obviously it's a solemn day. It's 21 years later. And, I look at my students and I realize that most of them weren't even born when 9/11 happened. They never lived through it. So a lot of them tend to look at 9/11 maybe the way I view Pearl Harbor. So what's your take 21 years later?
Like you mentioned, it's a solemn day, and I'm always thinking about the guys that were friends with that lost on that day, and also the fellas that perished through the cancers and illness and so on. But I don't think we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot, but not enough. And the reason I say that is that because growing up in the 50s and 60s, Smokey the Bear would be kicking butt if you play with matches. Stop, drop, and roll with Donald Duck. Air raid warnings, you hide underneath the desk. And if you're going down the hallway,
Bert the
you
Turtle.
have the girl next to you. Yeah, exactly. So I don't think they do a lot of education and PSAs enough just on that. And have we learned a lot? Yeah, but there's a lot more to go, especially in our education, especially with the kids today. Teach them about safety. They don't have safety. What's a go-to bag? Things of that nature.
Yeah, that's certainly a problem because emergency preparedness is not on most people's minds. And when we look at emergency preparedness, isn't this Emergency Preparedness Month, I think, right? September? Yeah. So, 9/11, what was the day like for you?
In the morning, myself and two other of my colleagues, First Deputy Commissioner John Onomat and my partner Mike Berkowitz, were in the process of reviewing a major drill on September 12th on bio emergencies, how fast we were going to give out pills of doxy and cyclone, so to speak, but they were just giving out peanuts and so on to the guys from the academies, both fire and police. And as we're sitting there, all of a sudden we hear this massive noise of a jet flying over, which you don't hear in that part of town. And all of a sudden you heard the explosion. And that was, to take it from that day, we just walked around the other side of the building facing south, and you can see the imprint of that jet into the upper floors of Tower 1, because Tower 7 was the one right next to Tower 1.
Were your initial thoughts that it was a terrorist attack, or you thought maybe it was an accident?
Without a doubt. It was too much of a clear day and have that guy buzzing at almost speed of sound into the building, without a doubt.
Yeah, and then I remember, because I was in college at the time, and I remember I was on my way to college in the first class when it first broke over the radio, and I knew it was a terror attack. Right from then, I was already aware of Al-Qaeda. I've studied Al-Qaeda, and were you surprised that they had that capability to take our own tools, our own equipment, our own critical infrastructure, and use it against us as a weapon of mass destruction?
Yes and no. The reason why I say that, the attacks in 1993, they were using a rental truck, and they tried to blow up Tower 1 there. And there was talks about having flying jets into the Vatican and other places in Europe. So when they did that, it was a surprise. It caught us completely off guard, obviously. And we didn't have a backup command center and so on. And no, I wasn't surprised. It was a mixed bag of feelings.
And when you first arrived at the World Trade Center, what were your thoughts?
Right off the bat, not getting killed by a jumper. Because coming out of Tower 7, you walked across that ramp over Vesey, and the people on the east side of the building were jumping in dozens or in droves. And you had to watch out for that. And I had to get into Tower 1 to set up the command post for the mayor and for the commissioners and so on, which was done. One Mike was setting up the emergency operations center and so on. So the dynamics is not getting killed and then setting up the command center there in Tower 1.
And that had to be truly frightening. Like, I couldn't put myself in a position where I have to make a decision. Either I'm going to burn to death or I jump out of a building, 100 stories. That's absolutely horrendous. And when you entered the building, I mean, as firefighters, you're constantly training, you're constantly doing exercises, tabletops, functional, full scale exercises. Did you ever train for, something like that in the World Trade Center happening? Did you ever imagine that was a possibility? I mean, I know it was a possibility, but were you prepared mentally, emotionally for that type of response?
Well, over the years, at that time, I had like 40 years in emergency services, and we went to very large events. The Avianca crash in Long Island, the one in the Rockaways, two plane crashes in LaGuardia, and plus major building collapses and so on. You had that mental exercise and mental capability afterwards, but to that magnitude, no. But you go on your instincts, what to do, what not to do.
And obviously your adrenaline's rushing through, and so that gets you through. As far as the day went on, we saw the buildings collapse, obviously, and as the day went on and the week went on, did it start to set in of the magnitude of what just took place?
Well, I think when I initially set up the command post, I went back to Tower 7, just to give you perspective. And I saw security from Towers 5, 6, and 7. I go, guys, evacuate the buildings. Because right then we had a second tower attacked. I go, everybody evacuate and go north. Don't go south, but go north. We evacuated our building, and I told my staff to go north as well. And when I came back down, we had myself and my partner, Rick Bilick, and we went to Tower 1. There I saw Father Judge and Joe Pfeiffer and team, and they went towards the West Avenue side. We went back upstairs to go to Vesey side. With that, Tower 2 collapses. Now, we had no idea it was Tower 2. We thought it was the side of Tower 1. And when it hit the floors, I was bolted about 20 feet towards the windows. And the glasses were being shared and so on. And there we saw, the first time I saw carnage in the building. And I, had a concussion, blew an eardrum, lost glasses, and we got ourselves out, covered with dust. And that's from there on, we knew we had to do a lot of improvising. No command center, no plans, no backup sites, which we didn't have. We learned the hard way that day. And then crawling around with the dust and so on, I was looking for my kids. I have, 2 boys in fire, 4 boys in police, 2 in the military. And we found each other in Western Vesey. And, all the hugs and kisses and crying and all that stuff. We poured water on ourselves just to get cleaned up. And then from there, it was an epic for the next few months.
Yeah, and working with the rubble at the scene, what were the emotions? I mean, it was horrible to watch, but at the same time, every time they found remains, it was a sight to see where everyone would stop work, everyone would salute, say a prayer.
Yeah.
What was it like for you?
Well, most of the time I spent rebuilding the Emergency Operations Center at P92 and managing 140 organizations, agencies, and so on. But once a day for 2 hours to be down at the site. And it was emotional, especially if, they thought they found someone that you knew, one of the firemen, one of the cops, and so on, because we lost so many friends. And at times I saw one of my partners from one of the rescue companies find another guy that we worked with, just fell on top and bawled his eyes out. So it was emotional and yet very respectful. And it was nice that no matter who they found, fire, Port Authority, police, EMS, civilian, they all stopped and paid respects.
And as far as, the first responders go, when we look back, I mean, 21 years, it's a long time, and it's like the blink of an eye it happened in. I mean, I can't believe it's 21 years later. When you look back, how much has the health been affected of those that were on the site? How much post-traumatic stress have many of the FDNY, NYPD, EMS, how much have they faced over the years? Challenges. I mean, we tend to forget, but this was a traumatic event.
Every year, September, October, I go get my 9/11 medical. And in 2002, when we first started doing it, a whole bunch of guys, coffee, donuts, laughing and joking and whatnot. That group of guys have dwindled down to a few because they're gone. All right. The esophageal cancers, the brain cancers, the skin cancers, which I have, the heart issues and so on, the suffering. It was like, it's one thing to be killed instantaneously, which is horrible to begin with. But to suffer for many years of the cancers that was going on, it was horrible. But I've known too many guys that are gone, especially when COVID came around. I knew 5 guys, once they caught it, they were gone within a week.
That's horrible. And do you think that we're doing enough to, make sure that their memories live on, to make sure that people do remember what took place that day, the ultimate sacrifices that were made, and the years of struggles that people have had to face?
Well, let me talk about my community where I live in East Setorca. When you drive by Ward Middle High School, they have over 300 flags on the streets, American flags. All right, they memorize it every September for about 3 weeks. They do a great job. When I go through stores, I go to church and so on, people always say, "Hey, Rich, how you making out?" My kids understand it because of a large family, fire, police, and military. They'll never forget it. And especially when I came home, it's my wife's hugging me, my dog's chewing on my foot. All glad, everybody's happy and safe. But I think a lot of people remember it here in the New York region. And the reason why I say that, I gave a lecture to the Department of Energy back in 2010, and some of the people were saying, "Yeah, if you guys had that issue there in New York, really an issue?" And it was a high level of people with depression in the west coast of the United States. I go, from what? So it's a mixed bag of tricks, and it depends on where you are that people will remember it. And my brother had a friend of mine that owned a brick factory in Salem, Virginia, invited me to do a lecture in 2004, and he had a piece of steel that was 2 stories tall. And he says about 50 people wanted to hear your story. I go, there's 5,000. So it's I don't think it's dwindling that much here in the New York area, but I think around the country, maybe so.
And what's your take on the whole Afghanistan withdrawal? I mean, it's not political today. Obviously, it shouldn't be political. But when we look at what took place in Afghanistan, now we do have to, say Zawahiri is dead. Osama bin Laden is dead. A lot of their senior leadership within al-Qaeda was killed. Obviously, they replenished the ranks right away. But we did make great strides against al-Qaeda. They're still a formidable force, and they are a sophisticated organization. But as far as Afghanistan goes, what was it like for you when you saw the images on the TV of the Taliban just recapturing that country within a week of our withdrawal?
They tried to compare it to the withdrawal of Vietnam, which was an orderly, planned event. This, to me, was a debacle. Especially when our military were killed. 13 of them were killed by the explosion, and people hanging off planes and so on. It was a horrible way of doing it. Should have been done? Sure, you could argue with which way, but do it in a planned, secure way that none of our folks were going to get killed, and especially those people that served us in Afghanistan. The people who helped us go against the Taliban. But then again, they left, $35 billion worth of equipment?
Yeah, that's the sad part. The Taliban's better armed and equipped today than they were prior to 2001.
Absolutely, and it's a shame that we lost all those guys' lives because of the 9/11 event. And the way we left it, I think it was a disgrace.
Do you think that, as far as today's threats, I mean, you're an emergency management guy, have been around the block, you know Homeland Security better than most people. Do you think we're taking our eye off the ball lately?
I think we're taking our eye off the ball in a lot of different areas, especially with the COVID. I mean, they gave billions and billions of dollars to hospitals and healthcare, whatever. And they were, to me, my personal view, looking at, except for Northwell and also the Bartholomew's, there were hospitals that did really great, but in the long run, a lot of them did not do good at all. What were they doing with the funds? And we took our eyeball off a regular pandemic, whether it was intentional or not. Hurricanes, there's a term in research called normalization bias. Hey, don't worry about it. It's not going to happen to me. I think socially, individually, and government-wise, there's a lot of things we really have to reevaluate and do a really good risk assessment on what's going on outside.
Do you think there's any will to do that? I mean, once again, as a current emergency management person, but former FDNY, do you think that the emergency management community itself, agencies like FEMA, who there's some great people that I still speak with that work at FEMA, but do you think the agencies need to be more proactive when it comes to planning for and preparing for disasters, whether they're man-made or natural? Do you think that they'll make the public aware as they need to be?
Like I mentioned before, Professor, is that I don't think there's enough education coming from the federal level, from FEMA, the state OEMs, all right, like SEMO and so on. New York City did a thing about nuclear blast. Okay, but what about the normal everyday water main breaks and hurricanes or storms? I don't see that education in there, not preparing the civilian, number one, and then also where they go to work. I think there's a lot of education that has to be there to get everybody on the ball. It's not just the federal government. All right, when President Reagan says, "Don't fear, the federal government will be here this week," you have to be prepared for the immediate event.
And you witness firsthand, disasters are local. I mean, that's what they are. They start locally. You might, sap your resources and request assistance from state and federal, but the local people are the most important people.
Absolutely. I mean, you put in Thailand 911 and you get the guys on the red trucks and the black and whites and the green ambulances and what that. Those are the first there on the scene to do whatever. But then you have the utilities, they have to be prepared, which I don't think they're really doing a good job. PSE&G has got a lot of faults, so is National Grid and so on down the line. Without those folks and also fresh water, you could have all the agencies you want, but you don't have that support from the infrastructure. They have to really get more on the ball.
And that's a good point that you bring up, because I don't think we talk about infrastructure enough. I mean, when we look at coronavirus, prior to the coronavirus, our infrastructure was old and outdated and it was degraded, but we were still maintaining. I mean, there was no doubt about that. All of a sudden, we're hearing about, energy grids being stretched to the brink, rolling blackouts all over the country. I mean, what's going on?
Well, I couldn't tell what's going on. I think it's they call it the chronic technical disaster, meaning that look at the Love Canal. No one really paid attention to it. All of a sudden, now people are dying from the diseases and infections and cancers. You have these bridges now, over 1,000 bridges now are unsafe to drive over. They have funds going to other social venues and so on instead of taking care of the bridge. The Long Expressway, the people jumping up and down for the first time in 5 years is now being paved safely. You could drive on there. I mean, that besides being safe, it also saved on gas mileages and so on.
Yeah, but part of the problem is when you look at the way they paved it, you could see the seams that they paved, and you know exactly where the potholes are going to be forming next year.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a shame. But I'm a big guy on preserving the infrastructure. I mean, the American Society of Civil Engineers rated all our infrastructure as a D-. And the only reason why we got D- is because our IT infrastructure is brand new. Otherwise, we've been a complete F.
Yeah, it really is sad. And when you look at it, I mean, we're supposed to be the sole superpower of the world, at least for now. We'll see how long that lasts. But I mean, when you look at it, we should not be having a third-rate infrastructure by any stretch of imagination, especially given how much money we spend each and every year as far as government goes and the tax dollars that are being spent. Rich, I appreciate you coming on. I want to thank you for your service. Prayers to you, your family, and all those people that you worked with, some that are lost today because of 9/11.
You got it. Anytime.
I want to thank my guests, Steve and Rich, for taking the time out to speak to the audience. This is a somber day, a day to reflect on what happened, the nearly 8,000 people murdered, and where we are today. Those who lost their lives deserve to be remembered. And we can't forget that. We can't forget the sacrifices they made. It's a day that I wanted to put politics aside because all those who lost their lives deserve better. And if we factor in the number of soldiers that were also killed in action as a result of 9/11, the number grows even larger to 15,000. Then think of all those people who suffered from physical injuries and mental health issues like PTSD. We're talking about a lot of people that were impacted and a lot of families. If you are someone who sustained life-altering injuries, I have a link up at the P.A.S. report to the September 11th Victims Compensation Fund. I also included a link to Tunnel to Towers. Tunnel to Towers does extraordinary work to help the families of those who paid the ultimate sacrifice. And while we can never replace the lives that were lost, we could try to make things a little easier for their families. So I included the link if you want to give a contribution to them. 95% of all the donations goes directly to the cause. Only 5% goes to operating expenses. So it tells you where this organization stands. It tells you what the priorities are, and it's to help the families that are impacted from 9/11. If you find the content of this podcast informative, please take 30 seconds to leave a 5-star rating and write a review on Apple Podcasts. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back on Wednesday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.